All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Good afternoon. My name is Corbin Campbell. I am Associate Dean of Academic Affairs at the School of Education at American University. And it is a true pleasure and privilege to be able to talk with you this afternoon as educators and education leaders and those thinking about whole child education at this time of COVID-19. And we do know that in a COVID-19 educational time and space, educators and education leaders need new tools and new ideas to continue to foster teaching and learning in equitable and excellent ways. And this is exactly why American University School of Education is hosting this webinar series to support educators and education leaders in this endeavor. And we've been holding these webinars on Fridays from 3 to 4 p.m. This is a webinar in a broader series that covers a number of topics from crisis management leadership perspectives to college readiness to STEM education during COVID. And this afternoon, we get the distinct pleasure of thinking deeply about a topic that could not be more relevant to this time when many students are learning online, they're learning from home, they're learning in their community settings. And so tonight, as you know, or this afternoon, as you know, Dr. Reuben Jacobson is giving this webinar entitled "A Renewed Focus on Supporting the Whole Child." And I wanted to tell you a little bit about Dr. Reuben Jacobson, who is the program director of our education policy and leadership programs, master's programs at the School of Education at American University. We're so fortunate to have Dr. Jacobson. He's worked at the intersection of education research, policy, and practice for nearly 20 years. He's committed to educational change and equity and has substantial experience designing and implementing strategies that bring stakeholders together to work on common challenges. And I'll just mention that in my capacity as Associate Dean, I've had the opportunity to see Dr. Jacobson do this in action in our own community among our own faculty in the School of Education. So I know that he practices what he preaches in that respect. Reuben has served as the Deputy Director for the Coalition for Community Schools at the Institute for Educational Leadership. And he also has researched and written about the growing field of school and community partnerships for organizations such as the Brookings Institutions and the Center for American Progress. And I also wanted to mention, just as an example of Dr. Jacobson's expertise, he has a recent co-edited published book entitled "Community Schools, People and Places Transforming Education and Communities." And just to further that background, Dr. Jacobson did spend 2 years teaching 5th and 6th grade in DC public schools as a DC teaching fellow. So you can see he has a range of experiences to support this perspective on whole child education. And we're just so fortunate to have Dr. Jacobson on our faculty in the School of Education and to jumpstart this conversation. I know he has also brought together a few panelists to help us think deeply about this. And I encourage you to engage in this webinar here today, and also in a few days you'll receive an email that where you'll have the video recording for this webinar, and please feel free to share with your colleagues as well as you think about who would benefit from this conversation. I did also want to mention that we have disabled the chat function in this webinar, but if you would like to mention something to Dr. Jacobson or the panelists, or you have questions, and I know that there will be time for questions, feel free to put those questions in the Q&A, which if you scroll down to the bottom of your screen and hover over the bottom right next to between participants and chat, you'll see that Q&A button, and that's where you can put in any questions to our panelists. And so with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Jacobson for the webinar.
Thank you very much, Dr. Campbell. That was a wonderful introduction, very generous, and I appreciate it. Again, my name is Reuben, and I want all of you to picture that you're, in your back in your university, and you're walking down the hallway, and you're headed to a brown bag, and you're getting a chance to talk to some faculty and some experts in a field, and in a very relaxed way, have a conversation. So unfortunately we can't do that together, but if you really put yourself in there, you can sort of smell that hallway. So that's where I am. I hope you join me there. Again, I'm Reuben Jacobson, and I'm really grateful to be able to share this webinar with you. a lot of it is built off of a class that I just wrapped up teaching, actually, the Whole Child Coordinated Systems, where students are engaging in this idea of the whole child, which is sometimes discussed in our typical courses in education policy, but oftentimes is unfortunately relegated to an add-on or in, something that comes up as an aside or even just in one class. But really, the way I tend to think about it is that it is central and foundational to the way we think about good child development. And that if we attended to it more, a lot of the issues that we deal with later on would be a little bit easier. I added to this title of the talk and our discussion together, because this is work that needs to be done together. No one teacher, principal, organization can do this alone. And so we'll talk a little bit about what the whole child is, talk about the systemic approach, the way people and organizations are working together as partners, because that really is critical. As Corbin mentioned, please type in and use the Q&A. What we'll do is I'll just talk for a little bit, not too long. This is not a lecture by any means. And then our panel will answer a few questions that I have already prepared, but I hope that you'll then ask questions of our panelists and of me as well. And we should have plenty of time for that. Before I start, I want to introduce our panelists. We've got Tiffany Miller, who's the Vice President of Policy for Communities in Schools, a national organization, but based here in the DC area, and who was also a professor at American University. She adjuncted for us very recently, and we're very glad to have you. And Sean Slade, who is the Senior Director of Global Outreach at ASCD, and is a true leader in the whole child work. You can't really talk about whole child without mentioning and we're lucky enough to have Sean join us. So I know that Sean has been doing a lot of work on the whole child for many, many years, and it's gone through changes over time. So I'm excited for us to hear a little bit about those most recent changes as well. I don't think she's joined us yet, but Mary Kingston Roche is the Director of Policy at the Institute for Educational Leadership. So if she's able to join us, she's now been introduced, and we hope hope to hear from her as well. So what we're going to do today is I'll cover a little bit of theory, just some background to help us ground ourselves in the whole child. I'll talk a little bit about programs and strategies that support the whole child. And then we'll hear from our panel, where we'll talk about the current efforts around what's been going around since COVID-19, as well as implications for the future. Oh, Mary is here. Okay. Hi, Mary. Hopefully, Julie Sarah, if you can promote her as a panelist. I'm not sure if that's possible. Oh, wait, there she is. I see it now that I've changed my box sizes. Okay, glad you're here with us, Mary. So then the panel will talk about the current efforts with COVID-19, the implications for the future of the way we do schooling, and as well as the policy implications that we're addressing now and will need to continue to address moving forward. So why this topic? You know, people are thinking about the whole child in a whole new way. Corbin talked about that a little bit in her introduction. It's almost like COVID-19 has exposed this idea that many of us have already been working in, but now people's eyes are open to the conditions that all children, really all children, are going through, and the needs that they face. And we'll talk about some of those. And the truth is that we actually know quite a bit about the whole child. It's not like this is all new stuff. We know from the theories that I'll talk about, as well as the experiences and practices that our panelists have developed expertise in, we know some things, and we know what works to support the whole child. And then it's also useful for us to be thinking about, you know, the conversations the last 2 weeks have been what are schools going to look like in the Twittersphere and in education articles. What are schools going to look like when we reopen? We need to be thinking about the whole child as part of that as we move forward. So the whole child is not a new concept. It's been around for a very long time. Sometimes it's called the whole child, sometimes it's called something else, but it's one that is consistent with what we know about good child development. In fact, when I'm an alum of American University also, when I was doing my master's in teaching, what you learn is when you're learning about child development and in the context of your teaching practice is about the whole child. So Comer looked at 6 developmental pathways and recognized that in his research that society, home, school, and our social networks all have an influence in a child's development and their outcomes. And the pathways that he described were the development of language, ethics, cognitive pathways, social skills, psychological as well as physical, and that those are all elements, depending on how you talk about it, of the whole child. What's important to think about is the way that those factors, society, home, school, and social networks, and we'll talk about those in different terms, but they're really that ecological system, are all impacting the development of a child and what we can do about it. Speaking of the ecological system, Bronfenbrenner, which is talked about the ecological human development theory. And I like sharing this graphic because it just shows that this whole child, this student, is at the center of all the work that we're doing, whether we're teachers, whether we're education leaders, community members, family members, or so on. The child is the center of our work, but that child is influenced by all these other systems that are going on around us. So like Comer, Bronfenbrenner says that context matters. The child is nested within a family, nested within a neighborhood, nested within a school, and all of that is nested within larger systems, whether it's government agencies, social service organizations, even the policies and the culture that we live in. Those all have an influence on children, on the whole child. Sean will talk about this, I'm sure, more later, but I would be remiss if I didn't show the way ASCD has talked about the whole child, the whole school, and the whole community. Because once again, you have the child at the center of our efforts, surrounded by these programs, practices, policies, and the community. And we need to be thinking about how those influence what we do with our students. I know Sean will probably speak about that a little bit more. So taking a little deeper look at one of these areas of the whole child, let's look at health. And Charles Bash wrote in 2011 about the connections, the important connections between health and education and poverty, and showed that when students are healthier, they learn better. And that we know that poverty has a dramatic effect, or a significant effect, I should say, on the health and educational outcomes of children. Bash looked at a few different strategic priorities and wanted to find where there were challenges, health challenges, where they were prevalent, where there was a lot of them happening, where he looked at where there was causal evidence that it would affect the achievement of his child, and that there was feasibility of implementation. There was a way to implement a solution to support the whole child in this health category. And he found these different areas. So for example, with vision, we know that when we treat a child's vision, they're able to see what's going on in the classroom, and they're able to then perform better. Breakfast, we'll talk about nutrition, I'm sure, over the next hour. When a child comes to school and is full and has something in their belly, they're able to concentrate. And there are things that we can actually do about this. So in addition to these different areas, my screen just flashed, everyone can still see. In addition to these different areas that we can focus on one at a time, Bash makes the point that we need to have a coordinated effort that looks at all the different factors that are influencing the child. So if we think about the different ecological systems that graphics that I was showing earlier, a coordinated approach that addressed, that encircles the child is really what we need. And a focus on just any one will be insufficient. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what the whole child, some thoughts I've had about the whole child during COVID-19 and the crisis that we're in right now. And I've gotten the sense, and I'm sure many of you have as well, that we've sort of returned to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You think about that triangle and the supports that we all need, but especially children. You know, safety, health, security, those things at the bottom of the triangle have all of a sudden, once again, become paramount. So for example, when COVID-19 broke out, the focus of schools, of policymakers, was really on nutrition and health. How do we make sure that students are getting the lunches, the breakfast, the meals to take home that they rely on from schools, so that they could ultimately just really survive this crisis? How can we think about their health? That was priority number one. And for the first few weeks, that's how we spent our time, was turning schools into meal distribution sites. Of course, we were also putting the packets together and trying to get the academic resources there. But most importantly and immediately, we needed to address those nutritional needs of the whole child. Physical activity, is an example you see here with BASH. It's something that we've been thinking about with COVID-19. People are stuck at home. They're not able to go out for what they might not be in a community where it's safe to go out and take a walk. People, so are, my kids are having this happen, where the gym teachers are sharing resources to be able to make sure that students are staying physically fit and active. There's been attention to social emotional learning at home. We know that home can be a safe place for a lot of people, and it can be a very challenging place for others. So I've seen a lot of responses from therapists, school social workers, and other education leaders, and others that have been in the emerging social emotional learning world, talking about how to help support children's well-being at home, as well as family members' well-being. Those of us who are parents all know how important that is as well. We've also been attending, the whole child is not just about the physical factors, the health, the nutrition. It is also about a child's cognitive skills and their learning. So while we have been focusing primarily on making sure kids are fed and active and safe, we know that our teachers have been working heroically to try to make sure that the academic needs of our children, the cognitive needs of our children are still being met, that they're still being challenged. Unfortunately, and I was just talking to a student about this yesterday, we're not meeting that need widely as widely as we need to. There's a lot of inequity about how many students are being reached. The teacher that I was talking to said that only 30% of her students were being served. That's a challenge, and it addresses that's going to be a challenge for that whole child moving forward. That is to say that equity is a big concern when we think about the whole child and what's going on right now. We know that all children are whole children, but the needs of some children are different than others throughout, in regular times, but especially now as well. We know that COVID-19 disproportionately affects minorities, especially African Americans. There's some just very troubling data, county by county, showing that disproportionality, and that affects the children that we serve. Inequitable. We also think about equity when we think about access to technology. Perhaps right after, along with all the food that was being assembled, school districts were working very hard to just provide technology supports, because we need to be able to, in order to support the whole child, we need to be able to reach the whole child. And that access was a real, and continues to be a real challenge. And then of course, we know that some families don't have a safety net. They don't have the financial resources to weather this storm. The numbers this morning about unemployment are just shocking. I mean, unbelievable. And we know that when parents aren't able to work and aren't able to bring resources home, that has an impact on a child's development. Okay, two more things before we get to the panel. That we do have some approaches to help. We have many approaches, that is, to support the whole child that have existed a long time before COVID-19, and that we might consider building upon as we go forward. And I think about it in two ways. One is about the programs that address the whole child needs, and then the other way is about the strategies. So school-based health centers are a great example of the way that a lot of schools have been meeting the health needs of children over time. These are places that have dentists or physicians or certainly full-time nurses inside the school site, sometimes a clinic, to be able to meet, to be able to address the health needs of children, sometimes also of families in the community, so that they can very quickly go get treated and then get back to class so they can learn. We have a lot of programs around family engagement with varying degrees of quality, but that's a way to engage the family in their child's academic life, but also to be able to address their other needs as well. It's interesting. I've wanted to study more about this and how it's playing out in COVID-19, but I hear lots of different things about family engagement, where some people are saying their family engagement is even better because that's the focus of the work. But of course, there's a lot of challenges with that as well still, and maybe our panelists will speak some to that. Social emotional learning has been getting more and more popular. It's very important as we think about the needs of our children. And there are lots of programs from Castle and other places that are implemented even as part of the curriculum. So we have programs that can address those needs, as well as mental health supports, other wraparound services, and I never want to leave out learning. So expanded learning opportunities like summer school, which a lot of school districts and community organizations are struggling with how they're going to address that now, to after school programming. We have a lot of expertise around that. The question for us now in COVID-19 is, what is that going to look like moving forward, and where does it fall on our priority list? Programs are great. We need our programs to meet those different developmental needs of the whole child that I addressed earlier in the talk. But a strategy that really wraps these things together helps sustain the work, helps make it community-based, and more integral into the work of the school and to the community. Our panelists can speak more to this, but a few examples are community schools, where community organizations, faith-based groups, government agencies are partnering directly with the school to meet the needs of children, families, and the community. Integrated student supports, wraparound services, where there's targeted interventions for students, whether they're mental health, health, or learning. Promised neighborhoods, where there's a whole neighborhood approach to supporting the whole child from cradle to career. And then broader cross-sector collaboratives. Some people talk about it as collective impact. There are also children's cabinets, but systems level approaches that bring partners together to be able to address, to identify what the needs are of the whole child, and then to be able to address those needs. Our panelists will speak to all of these, I'm sure. Let me stop the share. I just want to end with a few thoughts before we turn to our panelists about the together side of this talk. So this is a re-envisioning of the whole child, but as I've said a few times, this can't be done alone. And I don't think anybody here, any of our panelists would argue that a school alone is responsible for this, or the government alone is responsible for this, or the United Way alone is responsible for the whole child, but that we have to do this together. And there's three things that I think about. One is about collaborative leadership. And that is the leaders of our different organizations, our superintendents, our United Way heads, our mayors, our deputy mayors, and so on, working together to identify what the greatest challenges are, what the needs are for the whole child, and then to identify the programs and supports that can help meet those needs. The second thing I think about is, and that has to be shared leadership. If one person leaves, gets the start and then leaves, it goes away. The second thing I've been thinking about is data and wisdom. So you have to know the student. You have to know what the student's needs are. And sometimes that comes about by collecting data on the student and looking at school information, whether it's information about a student's homelessness or their immunization records. But sometimes it's just community wisdom. It's about talking to the people in the community and finding out what the needs are. We have to do both those things. There's been a lot of discussion about data systems and data use. And the way I've been thinking about it with COVID is really, how do we ramp that up to be able to, in a rapid cycle, identify our existing and constantly new and emerging needs, and use data in a wise way that way. And then the last thing is about coordination. We need the infrastructure to be able to support the whole child, whether that's at the school site with a community school or a site coordinator, if it's at the systems level with what Collective Impact calls a backbone support organization. Too often we don't, they're the ones who are thinking about the whole child and trying to think, how do all the different pieces work together to meet all the different needs of the child? I've noted that with COVID-19, a lot of organizations have had to develop those coordination skills. Some of them had them already, and some of them haven't. And I was, in some of the research I was doing, I was talking to a site yesterday, and they told me that they, through the, they were an existing collective impact site, and that through the relationships and trust they've been building over years, they felt that they were better able to respond to COVID-19 when it hit, because they had the trust, they had the relationships with other organizations to be able to quickly identify needs and quickly respond to those needs. It changed what they were, the services they were delivering might have changed from 3 months ago, but the needs of the whole child that they were working on then might be different than now, but they were ready to go. And I think a lot about that as we are in new ways developing our coordination muscles. What will we do with that? And what will that look like when COVID-19 ends? What will that look like more immediately as we try to think about how to return to school and to address the needs of the whole child? What will we do with those skills that we've built? Where do we need to grow? I want to use that as a launching off point to bring in our panelists, Tiffany, Sean, and Mary, to share a little bit about their work and how we should be, what they're seeing now and what they're thinking about as we move forward. I want to remind everybody to please type in some Q&As. I think that we'll see them as the panelists as they come along. But Sean, let's start with you. If you wouldn't mind telling us about the ASCD's Whole Child Initiative, and especially the new relaunch that you've been doing over the past few months.
Yeah, certainly, Reuben. And thank you very much for that. Not only my introduction or the introduction, but also to the panelists, but also the introduction to this topic around whole child. And I do think one of the positives out of COVID-19 has been a reframing of what we believe is important across our communities, and especially across our schools. ASCD, and people may not know us, we're a global education association based in the DC area, and we've been around for, 78 years. But ever since 2007, we've been focused around promoting a whole child approach. And you mentioned Maslow before, and Maslow's hierarchy, and we actually aligned or married up our 5 tenets, which in that previous diagram of the green, we married those up with Maslow's hierarchy, so that we believe that each child in each school and each community deserves to be healthy, safe, engaged, supported, and challenged. And just like you were talking about previously, there's a reason we have, and that Maslow has, health and safety as foundational, because without getting those things right, anything else we do is throwing good money away and throwing good effort away. So we sort of, we have a phrase, not that we invented it, but that we sort of align to, which is Maslow before Bloom. And what we're saying there is basically, you need to worry about the health and well-being and connectedness and safety and belonging of the child before you start worrying about their cognitive development. What's been really interesting, you talked about just recently how we've done a relaunch, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but what's been really interesting over the last couple of years, and actually, pre-COVID, is there seems to be a rediscovery or a re-questioning of what we're doing in our schools and communities. So we've moved, if you think back to 2007, that was really in the middle of the No Child Left Behind years, when everything was about standardized testing and annual yearly progress. And we began our work back then, but it's really been the last couple of years that we've seen this almost national and global shift towards there has to be something more than academic test scores. There has to be something more than annual yearly progress and how a 14-year-old student does on their algebra test. So we've seen educators and politicians taking a slightly broader view of what education is for. And the way that we talk about it is it's preparing people for society and to be successful in society. And that's not just productively, but also civically and socially and emotionally part of society. Two things I want to mention briefly, and you talked about them before, which is our relaunch, is we launched Whole Child in 2007, and we did it via a publication called the Learning Compact Redefined. So really calling out what's the purpose of school. And we've just recently released an updated version of that we're calling the Learning Compact Renewed. And it's our renewal of our commitment. But what we also did was we took a slightly additional perspective, which is, why do we want to develop students or people who are whole, who are holistic and able to enter society? It's not just for their own personal self-actualization, as Maslow would say, but it's also so that they can do something else for the common good or the world beyond them. So the new declaration that we've got is calling for the Learning Compact Renewed, but also for developing the whole child for the whole world. And so that we want people to understand that they are part of the world, the communities, the societies they live in, and they also have an onus around that. And then just quickly to finish off, one thing we've done to help in this next stage of Whole Child is we've also launched a Whole Child network of schools globally. And people can access that via ascd.org/Whole Child Network. And it's a free network of schools, but it gives you some tools and some benchmarks and some structure and assessment, all for free, that allows schools to start to understand, and their communities understand, where they are, what they need to focus on across our Whole Child tenets, and then gives them some tools and some paths to start planning that out. What's been really amazing is that we launched this in November, which seems like a year ago, but it was only 5 or 6 months ago. We've already had over 1,100 members, over 200 districts, and already spread across 40 countries. And so this is a conversation that is not a DC-centric bubble conversation. It's a conversation and a need which is national, but it's also a conversation which is global. I'll leave it there. I don't want to hog too much time, and let you introduce the other panelists, and then we can answer some questions.
Thanks, Sean. It seems clear that hunger for the network speaks to the shift in focus that you were talking about right at the beginning, and it sort of we can get into the policy, the different ways where the policy focus has been changing, maybe, and sometimes it's a big shift, and sometimes it's a slow change. Tiffany, Professor Miller, would you tell us a little bit about communities and schools and how your field has been developing really traditionally before COVID-19? And then I want to turn to Mary so we can learn about the community schools and family engagement work of IEL. And then I'm going to ask you about what's changed, how has it been different, and how have you been responding and helping with your field?
Sure. Thank you, Reuben, for having me, and also just for your the context that you provided for this conversation. I think it's really important. As you were talking about, the importance of the whole child and Maslow before you bloom, I was thinking, when I talk about CIS and the work that we do, we're at a point now, we were at a point before, and we're certainly at a point now where addressing the whole child is not a nice to have. It's not an accessory, it's a necessity. And we have to really start thinking that way. So at communities and schools, we place a site coordinator in a school to work with the school principal, all of the educators in the building, to conduct a needs assessment and figure out, what really does the school need? What do the students need? To come up with a plan to implement 3 different tiers of support. And through that needs assessment and through that plan, we're able to distinguish which students at a very high level need what we'll call a light touch, which might be like a after-school program that might be available to all students in the school. Or at our second tier, there might be a group of students who need a more targeted approach. Perhaps there's a group of students who recently who need mentoring or need specific math tutoring, something that's where students are grouped together and the work is a little bit more targeted. Our third tier of support are students that are perhaps facing are more challenged with respect to what they're facing. And those are students that we work much more closely with. In some instances, they're case managed. All of our students that we serve on the second and third tiers are setting goals so that they can sort of see, they're setting goals with the CIS site coordinator to see progress over the course of the semester or the year. Most of our students are sent to us for help with academics, for social emotional support, or for academic behavior. And you know, thinking about the context that you said and things that you said, Sean, what we know is that they're being referred to us for that, but there's probably something else that's going on underneath that referral. And that's what really our site coordinator in the school is there for, to really connect our students with whatever they need in order to meet those goals and be able to show up ready to learn. That's really what we see as our goal. And so we're doing that by connecting some students with basic needs. It could be food, it could be clothing, it could be shelter. It could also be helping a family that might be close to being evicted, helping them find out resources of how we can prevent that from happening. So we're really there as the connector to help ensure that students are getting what they need in order to stay in school. I could keep going on.
Oh,
but
thank you, Tiffany. That's great. Mary, tell us about the work of IEL with community schools and family engagement, and maybe a little bit also about how this works at a systems level, initiative level.
Sure. So great to see you, Reuben and Tiffany and Sean. We miss Reuben at IEL, but we're glad that American got him. So happy to share him. But so with community schools, Tiffany really laid out the premise of it, that the communities and schools model, being one of the strongest models of community schools, really seeks to look at each child as a whole child and figure out on an individual level what do they need and how to support them. And so as a strategy, community schools uses that as a philosophy, as an organizing strategy for a school. And the Learning Policy Institute came out with a helpful kind of description of community schools that we use often with policymakers, which is to kind of categorize the work in 4 pillars. The first being integrated student supports that Reuben talked about earlier. The second being expanded learning time and expanded and enriched learning time. The third being active family and community engagement, and I'll speak about how that looks different in a community school. And the fourth being collaborative leadership, which is really the foundational piece, which sees everyone as a leader and everyone as everyone's voice is important to be part of the decision-making process. So at the school site level, what that looks like is, as Tiffany mentioned, a full-time community school coordinator doing an annual assets and needs assessment. And it's important to note that they do look at the assets of a community as well to build on, as well as the needs. And it also looks like having a community school council or school leadership team that is expanded beyond its traditional, beyond a school's traditional leadership members, to include the coordinator, to include parents, to include, in some cases, students and community partners. And at the system level, the community school strategy has brought that level of coordination that Reuben talked about at the systems level really nicely. So we talk about collaborative leadership, bringing together the school district, important community partners, important local businesses, community foundations, all actually working for the same outcomes and goals for kids and aligning their strategy, their funding, their messaging, their policies behind that. And with the family engagement piece, IEL also has a separate network where we work with about 250 school district family engagement leaders across the country. That is right in line with the philosophy that we see parents and families as their voices are equal to those in the district making decisions, and so they should be involved in the decision-making process. They should be partners. And so it's not just a one-way relationship where the district or teachers are sharing information, but families are sharing information as well, and helping to make decisions about their children together with the teachers in the school system. And what we see in that way is there's just, as Reuben mentioned, the shared wisdom that just exponentially grows when you actually intentionally involve the voices of all those folks.
Thank you all. I wonder if you could speak to, so now we have a good idea of what the whole child looks like out in the field, and how coordinators are helping to identify the different tiers of support for all the various needs, and how schools and systems are set up to respond to that. And then COVID hits. What are you hearing from the field? I know all of you have been convening the network, either certainly virtually, but either through emails or newsletters, but also Zooms like this. What's happening now? What's different, and how have your networks been responding? For all three of you.
I can jump in.
Okay.
Our stakeholders or our members are educators. They're principals, classroom teachers, experienced teachers. So that's who we're liaising with most often. And what's been really interesting is we've seen a shift in general appreciation of the need to be concerned about more than just academics and more than just learning. And so there's been a fairly broad realization or re-understanding about the need to worry and be concerned about the relationships you develop with your students, the safe learning environments that you're able to develop inside your virtual classrooms. And so there's really been, I think it's almost pushed this whole discussion around whole child and well-being really to the front of the education debate. Some people who are perhaps a little more skeptical or saw education as being very much a siloed academic content delivery process only are starting to understand that without a safe learning environment, without knowing your students, without developing a positive school climate, then the learning doesn't take place and the growth and development doesn't take place. So that's been really interesting from an education perspective. And even as we start to, I suppose some of the concerns that we've heard most from teachers are less around continuity of learning, but more, what do we need to start to worry about to, one, make sure our schools, if and when they do open up, are safe and healthy physically, but also how do we continue to make our schools safe learning environments when we have whole populations of students who are coming from varying trauma-informed locations, and also teachers who are having to come from trauma-informed locations and experiences. So not that any of us had to have this crisis occur, but I do think it's changed some people's perspective in the education community, especially around the need to focus on health, well-being, connectedness, and relationships.
I think that's right. And what we're hearing from our affiliates across the country and our site coordinators in particular is that they have to think differently about the way that they're delivering their services and the way that they're connecting with students. And so I would say at the beginning of the pandemic, where we were still, thinking through, I think everyone was trying to figure out exactly what this looked like. We were really focused on, like you said, Reuben, like basic needs. It was all about making sure that kids were getting the food that they needed, so we were either dropping off meals or setting up delivery services or pickup locations and things like that. When we were able to, we were still doing, home visits, probably, still on a regular basis just to do the check-in, because one of the principles, the foundation of our model is having that strong one-on-one relationship with a caring adult. And so our site coordinators really relied on that in-person communication to be able to find out what's really going on in a child's life. And part of that is seeing them, seeing how they're acting. And so our site coordinators are really getting creative in ways that they're reaching out to students, whether it's through, text messaging, through Zoom, through different apps that they're using to connect with students. They're really focused on how to deliver, in particular, social emotional learning virtually. And so we're getting into that. And I think, again, like Sean said, you wouldn't want a situation like this to force a community to think differently about the way that we educate our children, but there's perhaps some interesting innovations that we can think through and now utilize based on this experience. For example, if the way in which we deliver social emotional learning virtually, are there lessons that we can take away from that, best practices that we can take from that, so that we can perhaps even reach even more students than we were able to before, when we were just confined, we considered ourselves confined to the school building. So I think there's a lot of things that we're still learning about. We have one of our affiliates in Texas that's doing an incredible job around mental health supports and doing a lot of telecounseling with their students. And, there are also students that we're not able to get in touch with. So it's also a matter of trying to track them down too.
And I'll just quickly add, definitely ditto with what Tiffany's been saying. And just to add a few more anecdotes, one of our community school initiative leaders in a big school district said that the district's director of family community engagement and partnerships basically said in the first couple weeks of this crisis, we would have been lost without community schools, without that strategy, just because of primarily the relationships that were already in place and that coordination that was already in place. And there's a lot of talk now about, and Reuben, you mentioned it, how to reach the kids now who are unreachable. And we already knew that this was going on. There were students who were absent from school who, that we worried about, but now we're seeing virtually some kids aren't showing up. And so to online classes. And so where community schools comes in is those prior relationships that were already built. And if you can kind of compare it to, in the same way that our country needs to invest more in our public health investments to make sure that we're more prepared for crises like this in the future, we need to invest more in our coordination and our whole child supports. And they're, like Tiffany said, they're continuing to do things that they have been doing. And a few really quick examples. So New York City has the country's largest community schools initiative, 267 community schools. 100 of those already had child care centers operating in them. So they are now functioning as child care centers for essential workers, so that there's that nimbleness to turn a community school into whatever is needed for the community during that time. In Bloomington, Illinois, coordinators are hosting virtual parent hangouts and student lunch groups. In Broome County, New York, they already have a partnership with graduate school social workers, where they now are doing virtual drop-ins to provide social emotional support to students that previously took place in person. So I think the work continues virtually, and it's because of the relationships and the coordination that was already in place that is making the difference and helping us to reach those kids that otherwise would be unreachable.
Thank you all. The time we have left, I want to put two questions out for each of you to address. One is, you've talked about what was there before, and you've talked about what has changed. Tell us what you think we need to be thinking about for the future, whether it's reopening, even if it's summer, some of the things you're thinking about for your networks. And then what do we need to be thinking about from a policy perspective as well? And that could be at any level.
Just quickly, this is just my own kind of personal thought about this. I've seen a lot in the education equity realm about learning loss and things like that, and focusing on the academic piece. And I think that's hugely important, but I think we need equal or greater attention to what we've all been saying, which is the social emotional needs and the whole child support. So I hope that as all of us who care about equity and children, I hope that we kind of raise that to the same level that we are doing so with, learning loss, to talk about the social emotional needs. And I know that in our networks, we are doing that, but to really lift that up to policymakers, to the public, so that we know there's no going back to normal. And then we live in a world where, in 2020, an African-American man was shot and killed while jogging outside. And so I'm sure that our kids are grappling with that right now, and how do we support them now as well as when we come back to school. So just as a general guideline, I hope that we continue to raise that importance as much as we do the instructional piece.
Yeah, and I'd agree with Mary 100%. I think what's going to be really remarkable about this time and trying to open up schools is this is not something that's affected one group in a school or even one community. This is something which has affected every student across the US and pretty much every student globally. And so we're talking about something which is widespread and something which is it's affecting everybody. So I think I'm reasonably confident that there is going to be a sense of relief once the schools reopen again. However, I think very quickly people are going to understand and realize that some of the lessons that they learnt or had to confront during coronavirus are still going to be playing out as the schools reopen. I'm fairly confident that we'll get back and there'll be a sense of relief that we're back in the schools, but then we're gonna have to start realizing that one, we have all gone through trauma to varying degrees, and we have also understood that ensuring that our kids, our teachers, our community feels safe and supported is foundational to letting our kids grow, learn, and develop. And so I think we're going to go through a bit of a sort of a W learning curve where we're going to sort of hit peaks and then realize things that were meaningless in the past, or things that need additional attention. Just the discussions around academic testing and how we're able to do away with state standardized testing. The question should be asked after this, well, if we're able to do away with it, then what was its real purpose? Not to say that we shouldn't have it, but I think we need to be discussing these things moving forward. And then in terms of policy, another positive that's going to come out of this, and we saw it to a smaller extent with the N1H1 crisis back in 2009, is that we are going to have in successful communities, health, education, community services, working closer together, sharing resources, developing joint policy recommendations, and hopefully that will continue.
I think the only thing I would add to that, I agree with everything that both Mary and Sean have said, is I think also I'm hoping that policymakers are keeping in mind that although this has impacted basically every student across not only the country but the world, but the way that impact is felt will be different depending on the resources, that are available in the school. And so I think that it's really important to think about not only the short-term costs and things that you need to be focused on, but also in the long term. And what we're seeing is that we already had an incredible caseload with respect to the students that were in need. And what we're learning from this pandemic is just how many families were actually living on the brink of poverty. And by missing one paycheck have been pushed there. And so all of us at our different organizations, we're gonna see only the need grow. And so I think in the long term, we need to think about how to meet all of those different social, emotional, trauma-informed mental health support needs by actually, making sure that our models are actually funded at a level at which that we can serve all of the students in need.
Reuben, I'll just quickly add really quick a concrete example of a tension that has already arose as a result of, we see states now like looking at their budgets and saying they're going to have to cut them, and knowing that education spending at the state level still hasn't recovered from the recession. So just yesterday in my state of Maryland, our governor vetoed the state's blueprint for education that would have significantly invested significantly more in the education system, including a lot of the whole child supports we're talking about. And while we're hopeful that the legislature can override that because there is overwhelming support for it, it speaks to that tension that this crisis creates, which is states and districts looking at their budgets and saying, we have to cut, what can we do? But at the same time, as advocates for kids and for equity and the whole child, saying, we can't negotiate a lower price or lower investment for our kids. They were already being underinvested in, and in fact, this is the kind of investment that we need to propel us forward. And so more advocacy is needed more than ever at this time, even though I agree with what Sean said, that people will realize the importance of whole child, but as reality hits with budgets and those tough decisions are made, we're going to have to come together as a community to really voice the necessity of these kinds of investments.
I'm really glad you brought that up, Mary. I've been waiting to see what was going to happen with that funding, and while we know, and I think a lot of people would agree about the various needs of the whole child, and they've been exposed in new and different ways, those funding constraints are going to be very significant as we move forward, and we will have to figure out what to do about that. I hope that I want to thank our panelists, Sean, Tiffany, and Mary, for joining us and sharing your wisdom, and appreciate your expertise and friendship always. Thank you. And thank you to everybody for joining us for this conversation. I want to turn back to Corbin for a final note.
Dr. Jacobson, thank you so much for leading this discussion, and I just really appreciate the insights of all of our panelists, Tiffany, Mary, and Sean. I learned a great deal today, and I have 3 children of my own, and just thinking about how to apply this whole child perspective to my own kids, and also how to be thoughtful, intentional, and caring in my own striving to be a good educator during this time. And so I just want to deeply thank you all so much for taking your time to be a part of this webinar. And I also want to mention that since this is part of a series, we have another webinar coming up in 2 weeks. So not next Friday, but the following Friday. We will have another webinar meant for educators and education leaders. And actually, I'll be leading that webinar. That's the webinar that I've chosen to facilitate. And the topic is lessons learned from higher ed, culturally responsive, inclusive, and equity-oriented online teaching. And I'll also bring a panel to that discussion as well. As somebody who studies higher education, teaching, and learning, I've been thinking a lot about how higher ed has really had a focus on this movement online for a couple of decades at this point, and we've learned a great deal. And just imagining how we might be of service to broader K-12 educators and education leaders as well. And certainly there's the whole child conversation in colleges and universities that's really critical as well. So many resonances across all of these topics. And I really want to thank the educators who came to join us today. And again, thank Dr. Jacobson and the panel. And we look forward to seeing you again for another SOE webinar event in our series. Thanks to everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.